It's funny because when I Spit on Your Grave got into all the trouble in Chicago, Siskel and Ebert went on the warpath against that. And so theater chains pulled it and replaced it with Friday the 13th and Warriors, two other, controversially violent films.
Today we're going to be talking to Michael Gingold and Chris Poggiali, authors of the book Armies of the Night. And today we're going to be discussing the film The Warriors. Tell me a little bit about yourselves and how did you happen upon The Warriors?
Well, I'm Michael Gingold. I'm a longtime writer, occasional editor for Fangoria, also write for Room Org and other magazines. And in fact, the very first issue of Fango came out in 1979, right around the time The Warriors was just starting to make an impression. I didn't see it back at the time, but I certainly knew about it because I was kind of a voracious film fan, even at the age of 12. And back then, The Warriors had this reputation for the movie that you would take your life in your hands if you went to see it. There were all the reports of the violence at theaters, and people thought that it was attracting gangs, which it was. And it was basically a dangerous film. And of course, when you're 12 years old and you hear that, of course you want to see it. But I didn't catch up to it till many years later. I think I may have seen it first on network television, where of course it was edited. And I can't remember exactly when I first saw it uncut, but I've seen it many times at theatrical revival since, and it's since become one of my favorite movies of the 70s.
I'm Chris Poggiali, and I was, similar to Mike, I was aware of The Warriors and the controversy surrounding it when it came out in theaters, and I was also of the impression that it was a dangerous film. And then in 1980, it was Halloween of 1980, it premiered on HBO, and a bunch of my friends saw it on Halloween night. And after they were trick-or-treating, they went home, and as they were going through their treats, they were watching The Warriors. And then like Monday morning, I heard all about the movie, and I heard it didn't really seem like it was as violent or dangerous as I had been led to believe a year and a half earlier. But actually the Halloween of 1979, there were some guys in my neighborhood who went around as baseball furies, like some high school students. So I knew a little bit about the movie before I got a chance to see it, which like Mike, I saw it on commercial television. I don't remember watching the whole thing on commercial television though, but I bought the Paramount tape as soon as it went on sell-through. They dropped the price on the VHS, and I bought it then. And I had it up until fairly recently. I still had that VHS tape.
And like many films when you're a kid, there are certain things that became iconic that I was aware of. Like I had seen the Baseball Furies, and I had seen some of the other characters. So I kind of knew what it was about, and I knew it had these kind of outrageous characters in it, and that just further stoked my curiosity about it. Or when I would see clips from it maybe on TV, and it just really built up because it came onto VHS right around the time VHS was just becoming a thing. In '79 VHS wasn't terribly widespread, and so there really, unless you saw a movie in the theaters or commercial television, there was no other way to see it. Which I know probably sounds alien to today's generation, but there were not movies available at the tip, the click of a mouse or whatever at the tips of your fingers. So, you just had to wait for it to be on commercial TV. And we didn't even get cable movie channels where I lived till about, I guess, 81 or 82. So it was a bit of a wait, but it was worth the wait when I finally saw it.
I would like to circle back to that because I'd like to start getting into just a bit more about the film itself. All right. So I just want to get a little background on Walter Hill. In terms of his career, he had initially he had worked under Sam Peckinpah and several other like really gritty, realistic, like tough action film directors. He'd been an assistant director and a writer for such films as like The Getaway. And at this point in his career, he's only directed about 2 films, Hard Times with Charles Bronson, James Coburn, and The Driver with Ryan O'Neal, Isabella Gianni, and Bruce Dern. And he's, at this point in time, he's kind of developed a reputation as a more gritty, realistic kind of action director, kind of taking after the Peckinpahs and other directors of that type. How does he get involved with the Warriors? And there's also a shift in his style, and we can get into that a little bit after. But how does this film kind of kick off?
Well, he was going to do a Western, and that fell apart shortly before he went into the Warriors. I think it was a matter of weeks.
Yeah, well, what happened was that The Driver had not been a success critically or commercially. And so when this Western film fell apart, he was kind of like, I better get another movie going soon, because, The Driver has not really done anything for my career. So I need another project fast. And The Warriors had actually been in development as a movie based on the Saul Ulrich novel since the 60s. It had a number of different people attached to it. And it eventually ended up, I guess it was through Lawrence Gordon got it. And Lawrence Gordon and Walter Hill had worked together before. And so, this came up as another potential project. There was a David Shaver script. He gets co-screenplay credit. And so that came to Walter Hill, and he decided to seize on that as his new project.
All right.
I think Otto Preminger was one of the directors who had been attached at one point in the 60s to the novel. And the earlier versions, the earlier attempts to get that novel made into a film were closer to the novel stylistically. It was more of a serious gang, youth gang story rather than what it became, which is a comic book version of a youth gang story.
It was over at American International Pictures for a while, and it certainly would have been done in their kind of lower budget, kind of gritty style than the movie that Walter Hill wound up doing.
All right, and again, jumping back, Walter Hill at this time is not really known for that sort of style, that kind of comic booky, like color popping style. How did he happen upon that? Like, how does that develop?
Well, he's always been interested in comic books. Comic books were very important to him when he was young. He had asthma as a child, so he spent a lot of time indoors and reading comic books, also reading the classics. He's a big Jack London fan, and also listening to radio shows and westerns. Watching westerns on TV and in theaters when he got older. So he's always had a background in comic books. But when he got hold of the script and first approached the producers in the studio about adapting it, his idea was that since street gangs and youth gangs in New York were not multiracial. They were not integrated gangs. So he said, the way to do this would be with an all-black gang. And the studio did not want to do it that way. So he said, all right, so this is basically going to be a comic book then. It was that. And then once Bobby Mannix got involved as the costume designer, so if you read Walter Hill's script, we have a chapter in the book about his script. It starts off with a list of all these different gangs, and he gave that list to Bobby Mannix when they started doing pre-production on the film, and it was her job to design a look for all of these different gangs. And that was another step toward a comic book.
Yeah, well, she decided to kind of color code everybody, so everybody had a certain color scheme that was central to their outfits. And yeah, she had, there were about, I guess, half a dozen prominent gangs in it. And she also designed the makeup too. There was no division between costume and makeup design. So she came up with the look of the Furies' makeup and their costumes, and basically created the entire look for all of the gangs, and some of which endure to this day. The designs are really striking.
And there's no, in the book, the gang is not called the Warriors. The Warriors is an overall umbrella term for the gangs in New York. The gang that the novel is about, that makes the journey up to the Bronx, and then they have to get back to Coney Island, they're called the Coney Island Dominators.
Nice. And at this point, so he has the whole comic book design, and is the studio initially kind of a little apprehensive about that approach? Or I know there were other gang films at the time by rival studios that were going to be coming out, like The Wanderers. Was this another way where they could kind of differentiate themselves, and they maybe felt a little bit more comfortable with this style?
Well, if anything, it became less of a comic book as it went along, because Walter Hill wanted to start out with comic book panels, which he eventually got to do with the special edition that came out on DVD and later on Blu-ray. He wanted to have the introduction, he wanted to have comic panel interstitials, and I don't know if it was the studio that said no, or whether it just kind of got written out in the development process or in the making of it. But he really wanted to emphasize that this was a fantasy. He kind of referred to it as almost a science fiction film in one interview. He was not trying to make this a realistic gang film, which other movies like The Wanderers and several other studio gang films at the time were. He wanted to make this its own thing.
And it starts out basically saying, like, in the near future, and I think in the script that's mentioned.
Well, as Chris points out in a little bit of the book, it's never really specified when it takes place, though in a subway scene you do see a foul play movie poster on the wall, so that definitely does set it in 1978. So I don't think it's supposed to be like futuristic as such. It's more the style than the setting that is kind of futuristic and heightened and fantasized a little bit.
Okay.
It's not like Mad Max where it starts out a few years from now.
Right.
And okay, so, and I actually had a question about the director's cut, and just talking about potentially the changes he makes going forward, because I watched both versions to prep for this, and I've always kind of felt I don't quite gravitate towards the director's cut as much as I do the initial cut, because it just feels a little too goofy and haphazard. I feel like, in my opinion, it pushes it a little too far to the ridiculous, where the original version, I feel, has kind of a perfect tone where it walks that tightrope of silliness, but it's still gritty. It still feels real, kind of in a similar way of the tone of Escape from New York, where, like, if it's slightly off, if the calibration is slightly off, it will not work.
Mm-hmm. And well, you're not alone, because again, as we cover in the book, the director's cut got very mixed reviews when it came out, and a lot of people did think that the comic book stuff, the panels were kind of too on the nose in terms of setting the style, and in one case it actually kind of ruins the reveal of the baseball Furies. You see a comic panel of one of the Furies before you get that great introductory shot of them in the film itself, so it almost kind of works against the surprise factor there.
For sure.
And it's framed, a lot of the shots in the film from '79 are framed like comic book panels. And
there are wipes and things like that.
Right, yeah. I mean, the one that I always use as an example is in the cemetery, when Swan collapses on the ground and he pushes his back up against a headstone, and he kind of turns his head, and you see in the background a police car go past. I mean, that's totally a comic book panel. Or the whole gang running down the street in the Bronx with the Turnbull AC's bus chasing after them. I mean, who would run down the middle of the street so the bus could, like, almost run them over? It's like a two-page spread, or the front page, the first page of a comic book. Or it's an image from a movie poster, which at that time, a lot of the artists doing movie posters were comic book artists like Neil Adams and Nick Cardy and Jack Davis, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, that shot of them running down with this bust bearing down on them is like right out of a comic book. And a lot of the shots, those are just two that I could think of. So it didn't need panels and bubbles with oh shit or whatever, popping up in the frame with them. I mean, it works better on Hill's movie The Assignment. He does the same thing, but that's like straight out of the Tales from the Crypt episode, that movie. So I forgive it in that film. I think it actually works there.
It definitely, that film in particular, kind of needed, I think, something to allow it to be any less problematic than it is, but it still is an entertaining time. But yeah, so they attach Hill, and then like the casting process begins, and obviously they're dipping into like the New York actor scene. I know there are a few interesting anecdotes about how people are cast, in particular James Remar's audition. Would you like to go into that a little bit?
Well, he basically went a little crazy in the audition. They auditioned with the scene where he gets handcuffed to the bench by the policewoman, and he was really like, he was grabbing the furniture and shaking it and going crazy, and really brought the intensity into the room, which they liked, of course, and cast him.
And thank goodness.
And there's a great little side story that I found online that's in the book where Tony Danza was one of the people who tried out, was actually briefly cast in the film. And at the time, he was a Golden Gloves boxer, and he invited Lawrence Gordon and Walter Hill to one of his fights. And he not only knocked the other guy out, but knocked him out of the ring. And he landed on the floor, and Lawrence Gordon looked up and said, "That's the greatest audition I've ever seen." So he was cast, but at the same time, he got the offer to go on Taxi. And he took that instead, and for a little while, anyway, that seemed to have been the right decision for him.
Who would he have played?
He was.
I think different reports say different characters, but when we settled on, most people say he was Cowboy.
Okay.
Because who's the actor who wound up casting that again? I'm blanking on his name.
It's Tom. I'm like McKittrick, Tom McKittrick.
Yeah, because he's the one who says that he played Cowboy and he took over for Danza because he kind of had a similar look. So we're going to go with Cowboy as the role he was cast in before he decided to drop out.
Right, because Terry Mikos, who plays Vermin in the movie, he said that they were casting by types, and so. Because we've seen that Tony Danza actually was supposed to play Vermin, and then Mikos replaced him, but that wasn't the case. They were they had different types that they wanted to plug into the movie, and so since Terry Mikos was like a Tony Danza type, they grabbed him, and I think the last part that he could have played was Vermin, so they plugged him into Vermin because. Tom McKittrick had been plugged into the Cowboy role when Danza left.
All right.
And then Walter Hill discovered Michael Beck when he saw a movie called Maniac, not the Joe Spinell one. Maniac or Madman?
I think it was Maniac.
Yeah. Because he wanted to check out Sigourney Weaver, who was in that, because they were in the process of casting Alien. And then he saw Michael Beck in that movie and said that he thought he would be good for Swan, and so it was.
It's an Israeli film.
Yeah.
All right. So he was when he was shooting this film, he was actually gearing up production for Alien.
Well, he was just a producer on that, so
yeah.
The Warriors obviously took up more of his attention.
Well, actually, he completely rewrote that screenplay, but we're not going to get into this.
That's a whole other
for sure. That's a whole other movie too.
He completely rewrote Alien, and
All right. And so the script of the film, it deviates significantly from the book, and as you've gotten into, the book was a little more realistic, a little more typical. Hill really pushes this comic book thing. And okay, so for his approach, for the overall look of the film, the overall setting, he obviously pushes to shoot on location in very realistic and very gritty settings. Did that bring up any issues while shooting in terms of where they were shooting and how potentially dangerous the areas might have been?
Sure. I mean, that was just one of the issues they had to deal with. They were filming in the summer, and another thing. First of all, it was mostly a California crew, and Walter Hill had never worked in New York before. Lawrence Gordon hadn't. So they were used to working on the West Coast. So they all got to New York, and they weren't aware that, first of all, the New York crews have a real issue with West Coast guys. So that was a problem immediately. And they had a first AD who just messed everything up, apparently. And so they had to replace him with a guy named David Sosna, who was really good and who came in and just took charge immediately and won himself Walter Hill's admiration for just taking over and whipping the crew into shape and everything. But yeah, they were filming in dangerous, not great neighborhoods, and they were filming overnight. And since they were filming in the summer, they had a shorter period to work. They were by the time they started filming, they had to wait for the sun to go down because it takes place at night, and the sun started coming up at like 5 a.m. So they didn't have a long time to shoot each night, and then they had meal breaks because of the unions in New York. So they ran into all sorts of problems with that, going over for the meal allotment and how much the actors and the crew would get paid if they're late for the meals and so on. The subways were a constant issue. What could and couldn't be done in the filming in the subway stations, and moving a train from point A to point B, and how many people have to get involved, and how many forms have to be filled out, and palms greased, and so on. So yeah, it was over and over again. It was a very difficult shoot.
And they also had the issue, especially when they're filming the conclave scene, of they're shooting at night and making a lot of noise, and especially there, but all throughout the project, the neighbors were not happy with these people coming into their neighborhoods and making noise, and so they would blast boom boxes out their windows and do all this stuff to try to just either to disrupt it or to get someone to come over and give them some money to stay quiet, which they had to do. And they did run into problems with real gangs. Again, during the conclave scene, they actually recruited a number of real gang members to come in. And some of these guys were pretty fierce, and some of the actors were a little nervous, kind of they weren't quite sure who they were working with, whether they were working with extras in costume or whether they were actual gang members. And occasionally it'd be the real gangs would be oh, these actors think they're so tough, huh, dressing up as gangs, and they were challenged them to fight. And there were issues all throughout the shoot. It was kind of a miracle that they kind of got through it pretty much unscathed.
One of the gangs in the conclave scene, they had different names from the script to the movie, but there was a gang called the Savage Huns, and they were partly cast, because there are 9. The story is that there are 9 members from each gang that get sent to the Bronx. So there are 9 guys in the Savage Huns, and 4 of them, I think, were actual members. 4 or 5 of them are actual members of a real Chinatown gang, Ghost Shadows. Mm-hmm. So, and we had this rep for being like always attacked. Like other Chinatown gangs were always taking shots at them because they were like the main gang in Chinatown throughout the 70s. And so they were always getting shot at. And yeah, so there are like 4 or 5 of them, and then there are 3 or 4 actors dressed up standing next to them. Mm-hmm. And one of those guys was Larry Hama, again, a comic book guy. And he was one of the Savage Huns, and he said it was pretty scary because you didn't know if somebody else was an opposing from an opposing gang in there at the conclave. It was going to take a shot at him, thinking he was one of the Ghost Shadows. So yeah, it was pretty.
It's probably a good thing that Bobby Maddox invented all these like invented. Colors basically, because if any real gangs were there wearing their street colors, there probably would have been fights or shootouts or whatever.
Right. I mean, there was one case. I think the original design of the Warriors jacket was a little too close to the Hells Angels.
Oh
jackets. Yeah. So they got like a cease and desist over that.
Yeah. A legal challenge, right. Not a street challenge, fortunately.
Wasn't the original actress for Cyrus an actual gang member who didn't
he was, up? And he just didn't show up on the day. And they got, I don't know exactly the circumstances, but they got Roger Hill in there kind of at the last minute. And he's terrific in it. And unfortunately, he didn't go on to have too much of a career after that, which is surprising because it's kind of a star-making performance, even though he's only on screen for about 10 minutes.
All right. And with all of these difficulties, and obviously it sounds like a very stressful shoot, I know there were certain aspects and leeway that Hill would kind of give the actors just to save time. Like there's the famous story of how David Patrick Kelly came up with the Warriors Come Out to Play moment because they were losing the light and they really only had 5 minutes and something wasn't working. So Hill basically said, just figure something out, mm-hmm. and we'll find it in the edit.
Well, he basically, his first idea is he found a couple of dead pigeons, and he wanted to like do something with that, and I was like, no, I don't think we're going to do that. So then he just found these discarded bottles lying around, these little about this big. And he based his performance in that scene on this weird guy who used to hang out in his neighborhood and used to taunt people in that kind of sing-songy voice. And so he just sort of combined the bottles with, Warriors Come Out to Play, and it became iconic. And yeah, it was one of those great moments that's not in the script. They came up with it on the day, and it became one of the most enduring parts of the movie.
I mean, they had to do a lot of revising on the script because they were shooting in sequence, and they lost one of the main actors.
Yeah, that's a whole other issue where Thomas Waits, as he will admit today, was getting a bit too big for his britches and questioning all this stuff, questioning Walter Hill about everything. And Hill basically said, I can't work with this guy anymore. And so he and David Sosna kind of collaborated in secret behind the scenes to try to figure out how to transition Swan from being almost a secondary character to the main character, replacing the Fox, who was Thomas Waits' character. And so the first night they I don't know who they had, they did the scene in the subway where Fox gets into a tussle with a cop, winds up falling onto the tracks and getting hit by a subway train. I think it was just like a grip or something in his costume one night where he's just running down the platform, and then the next night they got a stuntman to come in who we interview in the book and tells the whole story. And he dressed up in Fox's outfit and got into a tussle with the cop actor, and they just kind of rolled him onto the subway tracks. And the weekend before that, Thomas Waits just basically got a call saying, "Don't come back to work." You know, they just said, you're fired, essentially. So that was one of the main things, was kind of transitioning Michael Becca's Swan into the role that Tommy Waits as Fox was supposed to play throughout the duration of the rest of the film. And was fortunate that they were shooting in sequence, which meant they didn't really have to go back and reshoot too much to kind of correct for that.
Yeah, but as they were filming, and Hill was starting to think that, well, maybe this isn't going to work out with Thomas Waits. He started making little changes, like Brian Tyler's character, Snow, originally had no dialogue until the very end. So he started giving Snow some of, I think, Thomas Waits' dialogue along the way, and totally rewrote that idea of having him just suddenly talk at the end.
And then another thing was Deborah von Valkenburg broke her wrist midway through the shoot, and she had to have a cast on her arm. So there's a scene where she just kind of shows up in a jacket, and Swan says, "Where'd you get that?" And she just says, "I stole it." And that was it. She just stole a jacket. I guess the night was getting cold, and just wore the jacket over that cast for the rest of the shoot.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I never questioned that until...
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem too out of the ordinary.
Yeah. And then there was a whole gang that was cut because Michael Beck's character, Swan, is captured by a gang called the Dingoes. And they walk around with Dobermans, I think. And
they put him in a dog cage. It was a really kind of fetishistic subplot.
They keep calling him darling, and touching him. And
a lot of subtext there.
Yeah, they're all in leather. So he escapes and then shows up at the end, with the knife, which is something else that they don't really. He just comes out of nowhere and throws a knife at the end. And earlier in the script there are mentions of how good he is with a knife. And I think there's a scene where he's throwing a knife at a target. There was. All of this is to say that they were revising constantly while they were filming. So when they got to that final scene, I think Hill was just kind of like, "David, do something." Yeah.
And just jumping into a similar thing, I know Andrew Laszlo, the cinematographer, the movie obviously has a very distinct look in terms of how it's shot, lit, and just the colors in the film. But there's this great look for most of the street scenes where there's a lot of like wet pavement that just makes it look phenomenal. And by the time the 1980s roll around, like you have guys like Michael Mann just with water trucks spraying the streets down just to get this specific look. And it sounds like this just happened because it would not stop raining and they just kind of had to lean into it.
I don't know that it was because it would not stop raining, because I think it was more a stylistic choice. And in fact, there's a scene, I think it's in the cemetery, where they say it's starting to rain. And they just did that so they could set up the fact that the streets are good, because you never really see it raining too much in the movie.
Just once.
Okay. Yeah, just in one scene. I think that was actually kind of an excuse so they could have the streets all slicked down and reflecting, basically neon and all these other bright lights. And it really heightened the look and the color scheme of the film. And like John Carpenter did that in Christine several years later. All the roads in that are all wet and slicked down. It became a very popular look after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was for consistency, because they didn't know what happens if we start filming some night and it does actually rain. And then, there's going to be, the continuity is going to be off. So why don't we just hose down the streets every night and just make it a thing?
It works.
That's for sure.
Oh, yeah.
And so obviously it's kind of a fraught production. Was there any friction with the studio over the film as they were seeing it sent in, or was that kind of an easier relationship?
I don't really think the trouble started till after it came out. I don't
Okay.
recall finding much of my research about problems with the studio during production.
Mhm.
I mean, I think it was a relatively low budget film. Even though there are obviously all these production headaches, it was not a big, it's not like they went, way over budget like a movie like Jaws or something, where the production problems just ballooned the budget significantly. I mean, I don't know, I don't recall
It,
hearing about too many problems like that.
no, well, it did go over schedule by, I think, a couple of weeks, and it did go over budget, but comparatively, like Mike said, not to other films.
Yeah.
So, and the Paramount was in such good shape financially during those years that because I think 1978 and 79, they internationally they had some, I think, record-breaking rentals coming in for their movies, and they had they'd had Saturday Night Fever and Grease and Heaven Can Wait and just a number of really big successes leading up to the Warriors.
And Saturday Night Fever is often said, even though it's not about gangs as such, it's like a gritty New York City street youth film.
Mhm.
And that's credited as sparking this whole wave of gang movies that kind of came along starting about a year later.
Mhm. Yeah. So and then when the Warriors came out, it ended up doing pretty well.
It was actually, yeah, it was a big hit before it kind of had to have its release pared back. It was, I believe, the first movie that knocked Superman off the top of the box office, where it had been for a couple of months by that point.
So it comes out, and like how long did it take for the controversy to kind of kick off?
Not very long. I mean, the first two incidents happened within, I think, 2 or 3 days, I think during the first weekend. And again, they didn't happen inside the theaters or the drive-ins or wherever they were playing. It was always, people were leaving the movie and they ran into each other and ran into conflict with each other. It was three different stories. It was two in California and then one in Boston. In Boston, it didn't take place. The murder took place at a subway station well away from the theater. It was just two groups who had been at the theater kind of ran into each other, I think, on the subway platform. Words were exchanged and there was a fight and someone got stabbed. And it all got highly sensationalized in the press, which, again, as we noted in the book, was not a new thing. As far back as the Blackboard Jungle in the 50s, there were reports of teenage hooligans causing trouble in the theater or after seeing the movie. But this was the first time, I believe, an incident like that had resulted in someone getting killed. And so, of course, the press loved to blow all that up. And, there were reports that in one of the incidents in California that the gang involved was the Hells Angels, which was not true. It was said in the Boston incident that someone yelled a line at the guy before stabbing him that was quoting the movie, except that line is not in the movie. There's a lot of stuff kind of invented by the press to kind of make this more dramatic. Obviously it's very dramatic anyway, but they're really kind of trying to heighten the connection between the movie and the murders, even though, the movie didn't inspire anyone to get violent. It was just about gangs, and so you had gang-oriented audiences going to see them. And so that led to, security being called to theaters and the advertising getting pulled. And it's a whole long chapter in the book about these murders and the fallout from them afterwards.
Mm-hmm. And it carried over into the 80s with television when the movie premiered on network television. There was a whole other round of controversy, again, surrounding Boston and the murder of the teenager there. And in a couple of other cities, there were decisions by the ABC affiliate to not show the movie.
Oh yeah, and there were actually quite a few incidents that didn't make national news that were not, they didn't result in fatality, so I guess they weren't as newsworthy, but there were other cases where fights happened in theaters or fights happened outside theaters. There were protests in New York City. In fact, Curtis Sliwa, before his group was called the Guardian Angels, they had a different name. They actually protested outside the theater showing it. And the reviews at the time were very negative. The film received very few positive reviews. Not all of them having to do with the violence. A lot of them objected to the fact they didn't find the film realistic. They thought it was an over-romanticized portrait of street gangs. They thought that Walter Hill's heightened approach just didn't work. But despite the lack of review support, the movie actually did very well for a while before the controversy kind of came around and nipped it in the bud at the box office. And one of the interesting things is they did pull the newspaper ads for a while and replaced it with, instead of showing the Armies of the Night poster with the whole, like all the gangs lined up, it was just the title. Some of the ads actually had lengthy excerpts from the positive reviews. Though the interesting thing is that the original posters were not taken down from the subways, which is where gangs were probably most likely to see them, at least in New York. So there's a touch of irony to that.
Yeah, it was Pauline Kael and Janet Maslin.
Yeah, they
Both wrote really good reviews.
They were among the only two. I mean, Siskel and Ebert, their show was in its very early days back then, but they were both, they didn't say thumbs down at the point, but they were both negative reviews there. It's only been in the years since that the movie has gotten kind of a critical respectability to go with its cult status.
They used Pauline Kael's review.
Yeah, the entirety of it, I think.
Yeah, and then also there was an ad with Janet Maslin's as well that they tried out after.
Yeah. And kind of emphasizing like, this isn't really a violent film at all. And it should be said, a few critics like Vincent Canby and Roger Ebert after this wrote think pieces for their papers, saying, I've seen this film and I don't see how this movie can be provoking violence on its own. If a movie like Death Wish, which is much more violent quantitatively, does not, then how can you say that this movie, which really isn't very graphically violent at all? I mean, you could release it today, clean up the language, and it would get a PG-13 probably. The most blood you see in the film is when the policewoman or the policeman belt James Remar in the mouth and his mouth is bleeding. That's about as bloody as the movie gets.
It's funny, Mike just mentioned Death Wish, and when the Warriors opened in New York, when it played in some venues like 42nd Street, the second feature was Death Wish, because they were both Paramount films.
Yeah, and it's funny because when I Spit on Your Grave got into all the trouble in Chicago, Siskel and Ebert went on the warpath against that, and so theater chains pulled it and replaced it with Friday the 13th and The Warriors. Two other, controversially violent films.
From Paramount.
Both of those from Paramount too.
Oh man. All right, so the movie's out. Obviously, big controversy. And the reputation. And as you've said, it not beloved. How long does it start to take for this film to get reappraised? Obviously, as the years go on, you start seeing things like films like Escape from New York, even Hill's like Streets of Fire and other a little more heightened films come out. So do you think that had anything to do with kind of normalizing the stylistic approach of this film that kind of helped? Or do you think the negative reputation, controversy, and everything just kind of weaves together to create a...
Well, I think Escape from New York, and in some senses The Warriors too, kind of grew out of the whole New York crime trend of the 1970s. Because in the 1970s, you had a lot of terrific New York crime films. You had French Connection and Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, Taking of Pelham 123, which is my favorite. And so I don't think The Warriors, it may have influenced Carpenter a little bit, but I think it grew out of, and also just the fact that at the time, New York was seen as a dangerous place in general. It's not just The Warriors. New York City was considered fundamentally unsafe to be in at that point. And I think Carpenter was just as much looking at, well, I need to set a dystopian futuristic action movie somewhere. What city makes the most sense is when you'd have to wall it in and get all the criminals inside. Manhattan, and it's an island, of course, which makes that easier. But you definitely start to see The Warriors' influence appear in later films. I think, as with many cinematic trends, you have a generation that grew up watching it, and then 10, 20 years later, these kids or young people who watch the film are now making movies themselves and want to homage it or kind of use the same style. So I think it took a while for The Warriors to have that kind of direct influence, but then, you started to see a lot of films that definitely kind of had that aesthetic. And you also had, a couple of years later, The Road Warrior, which even more than Mad Max had kind of a punk aesthetic to the production design and the costumes and everything. And I think those two together kind of influenced a whole generation of filmmakers. God knows there were plenty of rip-offs of both. We get into that in the book also. All the films that kind of either directly knocked off the Warriors or their ad campaigns were altered. That was actually probably more, there were probably more ad campaigns that ripped off the Warriors than actual movies, because every movie, anyone who had a movie that had something to do with a gang, they started re-releasing it and making new ads that made it look like it was sometimes even more gang-oriented than it was. And then you had things like 1990, The Bronx Warriors, where the inspiration is obvious.
It's kind of a combination of Escape from New York and the Warriors.
And the Warriors and Mad Max, yeah. It just kind of took all of them and put them into a blender.
Mm-hmm. And New York at the time, for all the talk of, because when this movie was produced, it was a year after the blackout, mm-hmm. and things were really bad with the infrastructure and crime and so on. But at the same time, you had tourism was up. And you had all these great Broadway shows that were, Sweeney Todd and
Annie, and
the Chorus Line, the Elephant Man,
Best Little Whorehouse in Texas.
Exactly, yeah. So I mean, tourism was up, and then you had all this, all these like rap music was just starting to emerge, and you had punk and new wave and graffiti art, like Basquiat was just starting to emerge around the time that. As a graffiti artist, it was a really interesting and sometimes dangerous place to be, and it was at that time when this movie was made, and so you have this kind of collision of different aspects and sides of Manhattan and all the boroughs coming together.
Yeah, though if you went to the movies, most of the images you got of New York is of it being a dangerous place.
Yeah.
There were not nearly as many movies celebrating it as a cultural center as there were serving as cautionary tales of what goes on in the streets at night.
Sure, yeah, because you had Fort Apache, the Bronx,
that's
the
Juggler,
Wolfen, all these things that just...
shout out to Night of the Juggler, which is now getting a revival of its own.
Mm-hmm.
So before I jump in and we could talk about the book, I just wanted to bring up one scene that always kind of sticks with me in the film. The scene where they're on the train and the couple's just coming out of the prom arrive. And it's just that quiet moment. I know Hill had thought about cutting the scene for, I think it was said that they thought it might have been a little too on the nose. But to me, I feel like it really adds something, I think, pretty substantial and special to the film. Just taking a moment to show just how these gangs actually live, and I think there's this nice, very subtle undercurrent of just the obvious, not wage discrepancy, but just the difference between classes. It's not a class war film, but you can see how these people are living. I don't know if you have thoughts specifically on that, or if that, this kind of idea sort of enhances the film.
What's great is that it's so brief and there's no words exchanged. It's just some glances. And that's what really makes it work, is because you know exactly what's going on here emotionally just from the looks that these groups give each other and amongst themselves and to the other group. I believe that it dates all the way back to the book. I believe that scene is in the book. Yeah. So Hill just kind of took that, and I think it's just enough to make the point. There's no confrontation. Nobody shouts at each other. It's very quick, but it really in the thick of the action. This is in the beginning of the third act when things are really about to heat up, and it really makes a great little point in the midst of all the conflict and the tension, the other tension that's going on.
Yeah, I don't remember if the flower that gets dropped is in the book, but definitely the interaction with, I think they're a prom. Mm-hmm. I think it's two prom couples.
Yeah.
I mean, that's in the book. And there are a couple of other interactions that didn't make it into the movie that are kind of similar like that. I know at one point, one of the gang members looks at some of the other people riding on the subway and thinks that they're zombies, or that they're they're, Walking Dead.
Which was prescient because this was the year Dawn of the Dead came out.
Right. But they're actually gambling addicts coming back from Yonkers Raceway. So that didn't make it into the movie, but yeah. But I think it's in the same scene in the book.
I mean, it's just a nice little moment. Well, it's obviously not a nice moment, but it's a nice break from the action, a breather, and again, just hammers that point home. And obviously, the film is, even though it's not explicitly dealing with it, but you are dealing with like almost societal collapse and just poverty and yada yada yada. And I just think it's really interesting that they included that, because again, I think it just makes the film all that much better. But enough about that. Why don't you tell me a bit about the book? How did this come about?
Well, I'd been doing liner notes and featurettes for Arrow Video for several years, and at the time they were doing these monographs, these little books on individual movies, and they came to me to do one about the Warriors. And so I thought, obviously this would be a great kind of a fun project to tackle, and Chris knows more about that movie than anyone else I know, so I invited him to take part in it. And it was originally supposed to come out from them several years ago. And then I guess they just decided they weren't going to do these books anymore. They kind of discontinued the series. And so we got the rights back. This is a very short version of the whole history of the project. But so I brought the project to 1984 Publishing, which had done my Ad Nauseam books. And at the time, Matthew, my publisher, was looking to do a series of books on individual films, and he thought The Warriors would be a great one to tackle. The only issue was it was not really long enough at that point to be a real book that would come out as one of his hardcovers. So we spent a few years kind of going out, gathering more information, gathering interviews, and just expanding the book to the form it's in now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a series of these books that Arrow had been issuing. They did like the Hitcher, Blair Witch Project. They did one on the Lone Wolf and Cub films from Japan, one on Mako Kaji. And ours was going to be the next one, and it turned out that there weren't any more. Ours wasn't published, and they didn't do any more. But it would like similar to the books that are issued in their deluxe editions.
Yeah, a little bit bigger, but bigger in page count and in physical size. But yeah, kind of the same kind of thing. Just with two authors as opposed to a bunch of different people writing about the same subject.
We ended up rewriting almost the whole book.
Yeah.
And adding a lot.
Yeah, we added a ton of new stuff, and then there was some stuff that was a little either out of date or we kind of fact checked certain things and altered it accordingly. But it was fun because we found out a lot of really interesting little stories about the movie that I'd never seen in print. My friend Waldo Baptiste introduced me to David Copeland, who was a stunt guy who had double for Thomas Waits. And he did a lot of other stunt work in the movie. He's not even credited, and he'd never been interviewed before about it. And he gave me a great interview talking about the process of getting into the movie, which is kind of fun in and of itself, and then the whole process of going in and doubling Thomas Waits to help get him out of the film.
Why did you feel like so connected to this film that you had to write the book? Is there anything in that, like in the film, that you just really want to share with the world? To like, why is it so important to you? Like, why should more people watch this film?
Well, to be honest, it was a controversy for me because my whole thing as a film writer is I'm more of a historian. My big thing is kind of preserving the stories of these movies and either doing interviews or finding like lost journalistic pieces and popularizing the history of a film, and also the aftermath. In this case, the aftermath is very significant. And there had been a lot written about the Warriors at that point, but there had never been a real chronicle of the entire controversy, all the reactions to it from critics, from other people writing for newspapers, from the studios, from the theaters who had to get security, just the entire aftermath of all this and all the details of what actually happened, and setting the record straight, from the original journalistic accounts, which were sensationalized, telling, no, this is what really happened. This is the result of it. So for me, I mean, it was very interesting, of course, also to kind of cover the production. But for me, the most fun part was really digging into old archives and finding, like, I went to the Lincoln Center Library of the Performing Arts, and they had a file this thick of Warriors. Just all the clippings from all the New York papers talking about, stuff like Curtis Lewa leading a protest against it. They interviewed actual gang members. They interviewed theater owners about, what are you doing? And then at the same time, some of our other research, we found that in other theaters, like, I forget exactly where it is, it's specified in the book, not only did they have no problems, they showed the movie, and this is during its first release, they showed the movie that's like, dress up as your favorite character. They'd actually have costume contests. They're like, we have no problems at all. Everyone's just enjoying this movie on the basis it was intended to be enjoyed. So it was really that part of the history of the film that was most attractive to me when it came to writing this book.
And for me, there was a lot of that, like getting to the bottom of the controversy, not only the theatrical release, but also the television release, the broadcast a couple of years later, a handful of years later. But also its ascension to its cult film status. It's always interested me because when the movie came out, that was really when the midnight movie craze, I guess, was really starting to kick in, where you had like mall theaters and independent theaters also were booking movies every weekend at midnight. And beyond Rocky Horror and El Topo and the other Eraserhead and so on, they were trying out different things. Like, well, here's Cheech and Chong's Up in Smoke, which did really well, but
Another Paramount movie.
Right, another Paramount movie. And it did play double features with the Warriors when Warriors went to second-run theaters and drive-ins. Yeah, they were paired together. Also, American Gigolo was another movie that it was paired with. But yeah, they were trying out different movies. It's like, okay, well, here's the Warriors, which got pulled out of first run prematurely. It's just finished its second run. Let's see how that does at midnight shows. And surprise.
And one advantage to actually the delay in finishing it was so many media tie-ins to the Warriors have come out since we finished the first draft or the first version for Arrow. The Lin-Manuel Miranda musical, I believe some of the games and the toys that came out based on it did not exist at the time we first wrote the book several years ago, but have come out since. The movie's really had a renaissance in popularity just in the last several years. So I think the timing for the book is really good right now that we can look back. There's even like a fan film sequel that wound up on Amazon Prime for a little while. That was a case where I'm glad I caught it at the time because it was on Amazon Prime. I guess Paramount's lawyers hadn't noticed it yet. And it's apparently this very amateurish, fan production, and the reviews were just hilariously bad. That page has since been deactivated and all the reviews are gone, but I was able at the time to note excerpts from some of them, which are in the book as sort of a marker for how this film was received by the audience at the time, or viewers at the time.
All right. And where can people get a hold of the book? When's it coming out?
The official publication date is in October. We're launching the book September 21st at the Mahoning Drive-In. We're going to have the screening of The Warriors at Switchblade Sisters on 35, and we're going to launch the book there. It can be pre-ordered right now at 1984publishing.com, and Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and a few other online bookstores. It's already out there available for pre-order.
Most excellent. All right. Before we wrap things up, I just wanted to ask if you had any particular things that you wanted to talk about or bring up in regards to the film that I may not have gone over.
I guess the main thing is what I mentioned before, is that for a film with such a violent reputation, even for its time, it's not a terribly violent film. There's no gore. There's lots of fist fights and fights with baseball bats and things like that. But it's just interesting, and that was one of the other things I wanted to mention in the book, is that this film is not very violent, but it has this violent reputation. In fact, the original title of the book was The Warriors of Violent History. So part of the idea was just kind of looking at this movie that it dealt with violence in a fairly not subtle, in a non-graphic way, and yet it became a poster child for violent cinema for many years. And I think probably still to this day, people who haven't seen it might think of it, oh yeah, that's that really violent movie that came out of the 70s, when really it is much more heightened and not as graphically violent as you might expect, and certainly not as graphically violent as they could have made it at the time.
I think it's interesting that it's really the beginning of Walter Hill exploring and returning to similar thematic elements, because right after The Warriors, he did The Long Riders, which is a gang movie. I mean, it's Western, but it's a gang movie. And it's also a gang that's out of their element, because when they go to Northfield, Minnesota for the raid, they're definitely they're out of their element there. And then Southern Comfort.
Southern Comfort is a great underrated Walter Hill film. I got to interview him about that at length for Magnolia a while back, and yeah, it's basically the same thing.
Right. Yeah.
Same story, basic storyline, just two completely different groups.
National Guardsmen instead of a gang, or
roving gangs of
outlaws.
Cajuns.
Right.
I mean, the whole thing, and Walter Hill would completely disagree with this. The whole thing is kind of a Vietnam allegory also. Though Hill will poo-poo that whole idea if you bring it up with either Warriors or Southern Comfort.
But then you have the gangs again, and you have the motorcycle gang in Streets of Fire. You have another motorcycle gang in another 48 Hours. Talking about how we're the last outlaws and so on, and drawing comparisons to back to the James Younger gang in The Long Riders, and also Extreme Prejudice. You also have the different you have all the soldiers who are the mercenaries who are officially dead.
The zombie unit or whatever they call them.
Right, exactly. Yeah, they're kind of a gang. They're contained. Yeah, but you start to see him returning to elements that attract him. And I mentioned The Assignment earlier. I mean, The Assignment is a kind of a throwback to Johnny Handsome. So he likes to return to, or Red Heat also is a throwback to 48 Hours. Yeah. He likes to try out different stories, variations on themes and stories and plot lines.
Do you think the controversy of the film being so violent stems from the ad campaigns and just trying to push the controversy to maybe get more eyes on the screen, or do you think that kind of develops organically outside of that because of the controversy?
Well, no, if anything, Paramount reacted to the controversy by pulling the ads. They were not happy about the controversy at the time. The movie was it started out as a big success, so I don't think they felt like, we need to build on this controversy to sell tickets. They took the exact opposite response. Because the movie was basically being accused of inciting murder, and that's a very rare thing to have happen with any film. This was back at the time when movies were kind of protested more than they are now. A good example of the fact is that there's about to be a remake of Silent Night, Deadly Night released. Nobody seems to be protesting that, but when the first one came out, you had people picketing outside theaters and saying, "How dare you cast Santa Claus as a killer?" and you had Violent Night where Santa was a good guy but extremely violent and killing lots of people. Nobody seemed to be protesting that, so it was a different world back then. I don't think filmmakers really wanted to stoke, maybe for erotic films, they were happy to stoke controversy about that, but I don't think they were as eager to kind of stoke a violent reputation back in the 70s and 80s as they might have been later on than that.
And Paramount had really, maybe it was through their association with Dino De Laurentiis, I don't know, but they really kind of courted controversy, and at least they put out a lot of movies throughout the 70s that had one controversy or another, whether it's,
Well, Death Wish was held.
well, yeah, Death Wish, also, but I mean, The Godfather, really irritating the Italian American community. And then they did Mandingo.
Oh, yeah.
And, yeah, and Lipstick was another one. And yeah, and they started out the decade being one of the first major studios to kind of like jump into the X-rated field. I mean, they put out, I think it would be a Pool, The Tropic of Cancer, which both got X ratings.
But that was at the time when X did, as what a lot of people don't seem to realize is X for about 5 or 6 years did not have a stigma attached to it. You know, major studios like Warner's was another. They released Clockwork Orange and The Devils and several others with X ratings. And it was only as the 70s drew on that pornographers kind of co-opted it to the point where it was not viable anymore.
But you had that 1 year, 1969, when you had two movies with X ratings get nominated, and one of them won Best Picture.
Yeah, Midnight
Cowboy. And the other one was a Swedish movie, I believe, Apple in 73, which was, I think, Paramount. But you remember, yeah, so they actually put out 3 X movies right around that time.
Ajax. Do you think, because Hill has mentioned he's always kind of regretted taking him out so early, do you feel like that's the case, or the movie, you know, is fine without him and actually it makes sense to get rid of him that soon?
I don't know if it was out that early. I mean, I think it's at least, an hour into the movie?
Yeah, it's midway, if not a little more.
And if you think about the ending, when they're finally confronted by Luther and his gang, if Ajax had been there, he probably would have been one of the first to answer the challenge and to try to fight Luther. Since he's not there, it falls to Swan, who of course was not intended to be the hero originally, but kind of graduated into that part. So I think I don't know if the movie necessarily misses him. I think it's a great scene when he gets taken down, and it's kind of the ending that he's been building towards, because he's the most aggressive and the most outspoken. And he's kind of the one almost being set up to take the fall, because he is the most violent of the group, basically, just in his attitudes. He's also very politically correct in his language. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very dramatic to have kind of, he basically falls victim to his own vices. He thinks he's going to, take advantage of this woman he sees in the middle of the park in the middle of the night. And it turns out she turns the tables on him. So I think that's a great scene. And I don't think the movie necessarily suffers from having him out of the picture at that point.
But he's not even in the board game.
Right, yeah, well, that was a whole other issue, because when the board game eventually came out, he was considered too politically incorrect to be a playable character. There was some discussion about that on the game company's comment boards, some of which we quote in the book, where they're kind of trying to justify why they took him out. But it's basically, yeah, he has a lot of attitudes and language that have not aged well. So they decided to kind of, and the funny thing is, the Fox is in there, even though he was taken out of the movie much earlier. He's still a playable character in the game as well.
I mean, in the original screenplay that they started filming, and that they made some changes, they ended up rewriting it. Ajax's whole thing is he thinks that the Fox and Rembrandt are in a homosexual relationship.
Oh yeah, there's a lot more kind of anti-gay dialogue from the character on the page that didn't make it into the movie.
And so that's a whole relationship there that was rewritten. And then the Fox that has the relationship with Mercy. So, but in reshooting or rewriting as they were going along, that was totally cut out. So it's just Ajax throwing around, homophobic comments.
And I think he improvised the one in the park when he's confronted by the Furies and he says, "I'm going to stick this bat up your ass and make you a popsicle." I'm pretty sure he improvised that one.
That's a good improv. And again, I think it also it works. I think Walter Hill is still enamored with James Remar. Yeah. I mean, he cast him in so many movies after this. So he was probably like, oh man, he's such a good actor. I don't have him for the rest of the movie. That's probably where he's coming from. And I also think the name Ajax comes from Greek mythology. You have two Ajaxes, one of whom just some nefarious things at the end of the Trojan War and ends up suffering because of his actions against a woman, Cassandra, the soothsayer, princess of Troy, yada, yada, yada. Not to get too highfalutin, but taking him out in such a way, I think, harkens back to the Greek mythology and just kind of that legendary approach that this film is chasing after. So I see no issues there.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, you have Cyrus from Cyrus the Younger, and we didn't need to talk about that, but the novel was based on Anabasis. So, yeah, that's all detailed. It's in detail in the book. Yeah.
Well, I just want to take the time to thank you both for doing this, and I hope you had as good of a time as I did on this. So.
I did. Thank you very much. Definitely.
You're very
Thank you.
welcome.
Reel 1 was recorded at Open Stage Media Studios, directed and edited by Zebulon Schmidt, and produced by Paul Kazee.